All right, let's journey back thousands of years to ancient Egypt. Now, we're not just going to look at the pyramids and the famous pharaohs. We're going to dive deep into the very structure of their society. And, we'll start with a rare moment when everyone, from the highest noble to the humblest farmer, actually came together.
So picture this, a huge, joyful parade moving through the streets. Priests are carrying this sacred boat called a bark that was built by the absolute best artisans. High-ranking officials feel like it's a massive honor to just help carry it. Scribes are there, writing down every little detail, while farmers are lining the streets just cheering their hearts out. For just a moment, all of Egypt is one, celebrating together.
Okay, but once the music stopped and everybody went home, what was the reality? Did that feeling of unity actually last? Yeah, not so much. In fact, day-to-day life in ancient Egypt was defined by a really deep and super rigid social division. Your job, your house, what you ate, even how you were buried. Literally everything depended on where you landed on this social pyramid. So let's break this pyramid down and see what life was like on every single level, starting right at the top. The whole society was built around this principle called Ma'at, which is this idea of truth, order, and balance. And at the very, very peak of this pyramid was the pharaoh. And he wasn't just a king. You got to understand, he was seen as a living god. His word was absolute law, and it was his job to keep that cosmic balance in check. Right below the pharaoh, society split into these 5 main groups. The closer you were to the top, the fewer people there were, but man, the more power you had. As we head down, the population gets way bigger, but the status and, frankly, the quality of life take a pretty steep dive.
Now, here's something really fascinating about ancient Egypt, something you might not expect. No matter what social class they were in, women in Egypt had way more freedom and legal rights than pretty much anywhere else in the ancient world. I mean, compare that to ancient Greece, where women couldn't even own property. Egyptian women could run their own businesses, they could own land, and they were viewed as legal equals to men. That's a really important thing to keep in mind as we explore the rest of these classes.
Okay, so let's start our climb down the pyramid at the very top, right below the pharaoh himself. This is where we find the elite, the super powerful government officials who basically ran the country, and the priests who were in charge of serving the gods. The most powerful official of them all was the vizier, who was basically the pharaoh's right-hand man. The vizier was the chief judge, and being impartial was his most important trait. In fact, they would often wear white robes, the color of neutrality, to symbolize that it was their duty to be fair to absolutely everyone, whether they were friends or total strangers. And this gives you an idea of the kind of luxury they lived in. While most Egyptians had a pretty simple diet, a banquet for a high official was an unbelievable feast. We're talking roasted meats, exotic fruits like coconuts, tons of cakes and breads, all while being entertained by musicians and dancers. This was truly living the high life. Now let's check out the other powerful group at the top, the priests. Their lives were totally ruled by these strict purity laws. Just to enter the sacred inner room of a temple, a priest had to be perfectly ritually clean. And this meant bathing several times a day, shaving off all their body hair, and only wearing linen clothes, because animal products like wool were seen as impure. Priests also held the keys to the afterlife through the sacred art of embalming. This was a really complex 70-day-long process to preserve the body, which they believed the person's spirit would need in the next life. The only organ they left inside was the heart. Why? Because they believed the gods would weigh it to judge the person's soul. Okay, moving one level down the pyramid, we find the scribes. Now, they weren't as powerful as priests or nobles, but they were super respected. And what's really important is that becoming a scribe was one of the only ways a person could actually move up the social ladder. But that climb was anything but easy. Scribe school was a huge commitment. Boys started as young as 5 years old and could be in training for over a decade. Classes would often go from sunrise all the way to sunset. It was a serious grind. And here's why it took so long. The Egyptian writing system was incredibly complicated. A student had to memorize over 700 different hieroglyphs. They'd practice for years and years, just writing on broken bits of pottery and flakes of stone before they were ever allowed to use the expensive papyrus paper. This quote from an ancient schoolmaster, well, it gives us a pretty chilling look into how disciplined these scribe schools were. Teachers were unbelievably strict, and yet getting beaten was a common punishment for being lazy or not paying attention. It was a tough, tough road, but the reward was a life of respect and comfort, and you didn't have to do any hard physical labor.
Next, we get to the artisans. These were the carpenters, metalworkers, painters, and stone carvers, the incredibly skilled people who created all the beautiful art and amazing buildings that Egypt is so famous for.
So, here's the paradox. Artisans were absolute masters of their craft, right? They made these timeless, beautiful things. But despite their amazing skills, the upper classes often looked down on them, seeing them as just common laborers. In fact, they almost never even got to sign their own incredible work.
And their daily lives were a world away from the luxury goods they were creating. They lived in these small, cramped houses, and they worked in big workshops for 10 days at a time with very little time off. And because they depended on their employers for food, if times were tough, they often went hungry.
And now, we've reached the foundation of the entire pyramid, the peasants. This was by far the biggest social class. They were the farmers and the laborers whose back-breaking work fed all of Egypt and built its gigantic monuments.
A peasant's life was completely controlled by the Nile River and its 3 seasons. During the flooding season, when all the fields were underwater, they'd be forced to go work on the pharaoh's building projects. Then came planting season, and finally harvest season, when entire families, men, women, and children, would work out in the fields from sunrise to sunset. Hey, remember that fancy banquet we saw earlier? This really puts it into perspective. The peasants' diet was so simple. A typical meal was just some bread, onions, maybe a little bit of fish. Meat was a luxury they almost never saw. The difference between the top and the bottom was just massive. Life was incredibly hard. Peasants had to pay their taxes with the crops they grew, and if they had a bad harvest, they could be beaten for it. But it wasn't all just misery. The end of the harvest season was actually a time for celebration, a festival where they could finally feel some joy and keep whatever leftover grain there was for their own families. So how did the Egyptians justify this system? Well, they believed this rigid pyramid was essential for ma'at, for that idea of order and stability. The way they saw it, everyone had a specific role to play, and as long as everybody did their part, society would run perfectly, just like the predictable flooding of the Nile. And that leaves us with one last big question. From the incredible festivals that brought them together to the daily realities that tore them apart, the Egyptian social pyramid was a system of amazing complexity and contrast. It lasted for thousands of years, but it really makes you wonder, can a structure that depends on the hard work of so many to support the luxury of so few ever be considered truly balanced? It's definitely something to think about.